Imagine waking up one morning and the country you live in has a different name. Not because of revolution, not because of war, not because borders were redrawn, but because your king sent a letter to the world and said, "Call us something different now." That is almost exactly what happened on March 21st, 1935. And the story of how it happened reaches back not decades, but millennia. Through the rise and fall of empires, through the blood of conquerors, through the breath of poets, and through the ambitions of a man who desperately wanted his ancient nation to be seen as modern. This is the story of how Persia became Iran. Let's start where all great stories start, at the beginning, or at least as close to it as history allows. The people who would one day build one of the greatest empires the world has ever seen did not call themselves Persians. They called themselves the Aryans. The word comes from the ancient Proto-Indo-Iranian language, and it meant something close to noble or of good family. These were the tribes that migrated across the vast steppes of Central Asia thousands of years before the Common Era, fanning out across the subcontinent and into the Middle East, carrying with them their languages, their gods, and their identity. When a group of these tribes settled on the Iranian plateau, in the region the Greeks would later call Persis, roughly corresponding to the modern province of Fars in southern Iran, the outside world began calling them Persians. But here is the key distinction that sits at the very heart of this story. The people themselves never stopped using the word Iran. It is a direct linguistic descendant of Aryan. In their own language, in their own literature, in their own hearts, the land was always Iransha, the kingdom of Iran, the land of the Aryans. When Darius the Great carved his famous inscription at Behistun into a cliff face around 515 BCE, he described himself as a Persian king, yes, but also as an Aryan, of Aryan lineage. The two identities coexisted for centuries, one facing inward, one facing outward. The Greeks, characteristically, paid little attention to what anyone else called themselves. They heard Persis, they saw the armies marching from that direction, and they called the whole civilization Persian. When Alexander the Great swept across the known world and shattered the Achaemenid Empire in the 330 SBC, it was the Persian Empire he claimed to have conquered. And because so much of what the Western world knows about ancient history was filtered through Greek sources, the name stuck in European consciousness like a boot in mud. The Persian Empire, at its peak under Cyrus the Great and his successors, was staggering in scale. It stretched from modern-day Libya and Turkey in the west to the edges of India in the east. It contained perhaps 40% of the entire world's population at the time. It was administered with a sophistication that Rome would later study and imitate. Divided into satrapies, connected by the famous royal road, governed by a bureaucracy that was, for its era, almost shockingly enlightened. Cyrus himself issued what some historians call the world's first charter of human rights, carved on a clay cylinder declaring that peoples of conquered lands could keep their religions, their customs, their ways of life. This was not just tolerance, it was policy. And yet, despite all of this greatness, the empire fell. Alexander arrived, burned Persepolis, the jeweled capital of the Achaemenids, and in doing so, burned a chapter of history that could never be fully recovered. But empires, like fires, leave embers. The Iranian plateau was never truly conquered in spirit, only in governance. After Alexander's death and the fragmentation of his empire, the Parthians rose, another Iranian people, and reclaimed the east. After the Parthians, the Sasanians. Each of these empires understood themselves as heirs to the great Aryan legacy as inheritors of Iran. The Sasanian Empire, which ruled from the 3rd to the 7th centuries CE, was militarily equal to Rome and then to Byzantium, engaged in centuries of warfare with the Western world's greatest powers, and considered itself the custodian of a civilization that predated them all. Then came the Arab conquest of the 7th century, and everything changed again. The armies of Islam swept out of the Arabian Peninsula with a ferocity and speed that stunned the ancient world. The Sasanian Empire, exhausted by decades of war with Byzantium and torn by internal power struggles, collapsed in a series of catastrophic battles. By 651 CE, the last Sasanian emperor was dead, and the Iranian plateau had become part of the rapidly expanding Islamic Caliphate. For the first time in its long history, Iran was ruled by outsiders who were not just politically different, but religiously and linguistically different too. What happened next is one of the most fascinating acts of cultural resistance in human history. The Iranians converted to Islam, and in converting, they did not disappear into it. They transformed it. Iranian scholars, poets, scientists, and administrators became the intellectual backbone of the Islamic Golden Age. The Persian language, rather than being erased by Arabic, absorbed it, enriched itself with it, and re-emerged as one of the great literary languages of the medieval world. The poetry of Rumi, Hafez, and Ferdowsi, composed in Persian, not Arabic, would eventually be translated into dozens of languages and read across the globe. Ferdowsi's Shahnameh, the Book of Kings, written around the year 1000 CE, was a conscious and deliberate act of cultural preservation, an epic poem that told the mythological and historical story of Iran from creation to the Arab conquest, written in Persian so pure it contained almost no Arabic loanwords. It was, in a sense, a national identity in verse. The name Iran never went away. Throughout the medieval period, the region was called Iran by its inhabitants. Even as it fractured into competing dynasties and kingdoms, even as it was invaded by the Mongols in the 13th century and remade again. When the Safavid dynasty united the Iranian plateau in the 16th century and made Twelver Shia Islam the state religion, a decision that would forever distinguish Iran from its Sunni neighbors, the land they ruled was called Iran. The Safavids understood themselves as Persian kings in the full, ancient, unbroken sense. So why, then, did the outside world persist in calling it Persia for so many centuries? The answer is partly inertia, partly Greek legacy, and partly the mechanics of diplomacy. When European powers, the British, the French, the Russians, began engaging with the Iranian court in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, they inherited the vocabulary of the ancient Greeks. Their maps said Persia, their encyclopedias said Persia, their diplomatic letters were addressed to the King of Persia. It was, to the Iranians, a foreign imposition, a name that referred to one specific southwestern province of a much larger civilization. But it was the name that stuck in the Western imagination. By the late 19th century, Iran was weakened, carved up between British and Russian spheres of influence, humiliated by concession treaties that handed its oil, its telegraph lines, and its trade routes to foreign powers. A constitutional revolution in 1905 had tried to modernize the country and limit the power of the Qajar dynasty. But the Qajars proved too weak and too corrupt to lead a genuine transformation. The country needed something dramatic. It needed reinvention. Enter Reza Khan, He was a soldier, the son of a military officer from the Caspian region, and he had worked his way up through the Iranian Cossack Brigade, an Iranian military unit trained and originally officered by Russians. In 1921, he led a coup that seized control of the government. By 1925, the Qajar dynasty was formally dissolved, and Reza Khan became Reza Shah Pahlavi, the founder of the Pahlavi dynasty, the new ruler of Iran, and a man with an obsession. His obsession was modernity. He had watched Mustafa Kemal Ataturk transform Turkey from the ruins of the Ottoman Empire into a westernized, secular republic. And he wanted something similar for Iran. He built roads and railways. He established secular universities. He unveiled women, literally, banning the hijab and ordering police to remove it by force if necessary. He replaced Islamic courts with a civil legal system. He wanted Iran to look to the outside world like a modern nation. And a modern nation, he believed, needed a modern name. Or rather, it needed the world to finally use the correct one. In 1935, Reza Shah sent a circular to all foreign embassies and governments with a simple, direct request: stop calling us Persia. We are Iran. We have always been Iran. Call us what we call ourselves. The official explanation was straightforward. Iran was the name the people had always used, and Persia was a colonial-era Western imposition derived from a single province. But historians have noted the timing and the subtext. Reza Shah had significant admiration for Nazi Germany, and the Nazi ideologues of the 1930s had been actively promoting the concept of Aryan racial identity and Aryan civilization. The word Iran, land of the Aryans, carried that resonance. It was a message about lineage, about racial pride, about a civilization that predated and, in the Shah's view, surpassed the colonizing powers of Europe. Whether for the purest historical reasons or for the ideological ones, the world complied. Maps were redrawn, encyclopedias were updated, diplomatic correspondence changed its salutations. Persia, the name that had echoed through 2,500 years of Western history, through Herodotus and Xenophon and Shakespeare and Keats, was officially retired. But here is the beautiful, complicated truth at the heart of this story. The name change was not really a change at all. It was a correction. It was Iran telling the world what Iran had always known about itself. The civilization on that plateau, the one that built Persepolis and wrote the Shahnameh and invented chess and gave the world its first declaration of human rights and produced the poetry of Hafez, had never called itself Persia. That was always someone else's word. Iran was, is, and in its own memory has always been Iran. The name endured through the conquests of Alexander, through the Arab armies, through the Mongol hordes, through the British and Russian empires. It survived as a whisper in poetry, as a declaration in stone, as a word passed from father to son across 100 generations. And on that March morning in 1935, it simply stopped whispering. When you look at Iran today, with all its contradictions, its revolutionary history, its ancient culture pressing up against its modern politics, its people caught between a glorious past and a complicated present, you are looking at a civilization that has spent 3,000 years refusing to disappear. The name is not just geography, it is memory. It is survival. It is identity carved in stone and written in verse and spoken in the dark. Persia never truly became Iran. Iran simply, finally, made the world remember what it had always been called. If you found this story compelling, subscribe and hit the bell. There is so much more history waiting to be told. And leave a comment below. Did you know Iran and Persia were the same country? Or did this come as a surprise?